Welcome back to Truck Tech, everyone. I'm your host, Alan Adler. This week, we're going to spend a little bit of time away from electrification. We're not going to talk about autonomy, but we are going to talk about fuels. We're going to talk about a range of fuels, and we're going to talk about engines, and that is the internal combustion engine, which really does continue to and will for many, many years drive this industry. Our guest today is Schaeffer, who is the executive director of the Engine Technology Forum. Kind of a new name still. It used to be known as the Diesel Technology Forum, but it is still about the business of trying to show that there are very good things that can happen with internal combustion engines, and that we don't have to throw out this technology to embrace something new. Alan, welcome to Truck Tech.
Great to be with you, Alan.
Yeah, we've had a number of conversations recently, and I feel like, there's maybe three areas that we ought to spend a little time on today. Maybe the first is decarbonization overall, right? I mean, there's been a lot of work done, and I think you could probably spend all of our time telling me stats of how the improvements that have come to internal combustion engines, to diesel engines particularly, but I think you've expanded some of your messaging, if you will, over the last year since you made that change. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. And when you think about decarbonization, I think the one thing that comes to mind for us is that there are many ways to do that. If we are truly talking about removing carbon out of our economy, whether it's transportation or some other sector, we should really value all the tools and approaches that we have to get there. And I think some of the discussion tends to skew more towards electrification, because some of the policy and some of the rhetoric, frankly, has skewed that way. But when you get right down to it, there's all kinds of ways to take carbon out of the trucking industry. And we're expanding our mission to talk about all of those.
Well, and I think as you do that, we've heard now, we're hearing more and more from the industry, for example, about hydrogen combustion engines. There's a number of folks working on them. They seem to be sort of more toward the end of the decade than tomorrow. But, in Europe, we've seen moves to sort of look the other way or to wink at, well, a little bit of nitrogen oxide emissions would be left, because anytime, right, you burn something, you create nitrogen. So I think, the idea that the Europeans anyway have begun to look at saying, look, we're good with calling these zero emission engines if you're running, hydrogen as the fuel. Do we need to see that happen here for these to really catch on, that kind of government?
Well, I think we need to have supportive policies that give hydrogen internal combustion engines, a chance, and that means being included as a zero emission technology. And I think, when you sit back and look at decarbonization on a broad scale, what's the easiest thing to do? And the easiest thing to do in fleets of millions of vehicles and people is to really just change out the fuel. And if you can change out the fuel to a lower carbon fuel, then you could have a much broader incremental impact across the entire fleet, not just one specific place or technology waiting for a new charging infrastructure, a new vehicle to deliver the benefit. So I think we need to have rational government policy that respects all kinds of options for decarbonization. And there's some great ones for internal combustion. You mentioned one with hydrogen ICE, but my gosh, renewable natural gas today can get into the negative territory in terms of carbon reduction. So there's this tremendous opportunity there, and I think we know how to do all of those.
Well, one of the things and I'll just stay with hydrogen for one more minute. I mean, we still have some infrastructure issues around getting fuel, and I suspect the whole well to wheels issue. Where is that hydrogen coming from? If you're pulling it off of natural gas, for example, is it really a clean solution? These are all things that are interlocked and have to be considered. You can't just obviously take them in a vacuum. But I do think that when we talk about RNG, and you mentioned, sort of negative net zero without saying that word, dairy is a tremendous source of that. Dairy waste, I should say, is a tremendous source. I think it's 300% below the standards that were proposed in phase 3 greenhouse gas, right?
Indeed. And both dairy and landfill gas have tremendous opportunity in the U.S. And we have some really good experience there. And we have some new technology engines coming out now from Cummins. Their new X15 Helm engine platform is getting a lot of positive coverage. And I think that's going to be a big deal for fleets that are already invested in natural gas. And for those that haven't invested that way yet, maybe draw them more closely to that. So I think, there's the industry is stepping forward with some of these new ways to decarbonize with more efficient engine technology that can take advantage of some of these lower carbon fuels.
Right. Well, and it's interesting. I just spent some time in Jamestown, New York, where they're making that X15N engine, and spent time there and opportunity to go through the plant and to see what they are doing. Obviously, they're starting with the natural gas engine. They've got tons of experience with it because of starting in China, and then bringing it here. They've got obviously make it ready for the U.S. But there's some real big numbers out there in terms of the step change from 1 to 2% penetration for natural gas to maybe 10 or 15 or 20%, depending who you listen to. And it feels like that one, especially, almost 100% of your natural gas in California is RNG, and what is it, 80% nationally, I think, right now.
Yeah, and I think, natural gas has had a flash in the pan maybe 10 or 15 years ago, sort of up against diesel at the time. And, it was a lower cost alternative because of all the emissions requirements for diesel engines. And those emission standard milestones came and went. Manufacturers, perfected the SCR technology and enabled diesel to get very low in emissions. And meanwhile, natural gas really, continued to grow a little bit, but never really took off as a main challenger to diesel. And whether or not that will take place in the current time frame, I think is yet to be determined. But I do think it's going to have a great growth potential because as you sit back and look at other options to decarbonize, again, that big framework of how can I decarbonize? Here's my 5 choices. You might not have thought of natural gas as one in the past, but maybe now that looks like a much better choice given the issues about diesel, whatever you might say there, electrification being out of touch, too far away, too expensive, whatever. Natural gas, if you have access to it, that can be a real positive. I think one of the challenges we have there is that a lot of the environmental community and others, one of the missions is to get rid of natural gas, right? In all different forms and uses because it's still a fossil-based energy. And, that's not the case for renewables so much, but we have, ways to go to kind of sort that out as well.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's funny because, most of what we talk about these days is RNG. We don't tend to focus as much on, as you said, petroleum-based natural gas. But this particular engine that you referenced, the Cummins 15-liter, really opens up a big group of use cases that were not there with their 12-liter. And, so we don't need to spend any more time on that. But I guess we also need to talk, though, about renewable diesel. And we'll I want to get to California in a moment, but I think we need to talk about it in general. It's really just a California fuel right now, isn't it?
Pretty much. If you look at where the volumes are today, there's certainly the majority of California is running renewable diesel fuel. And, there's some penetration now beginning more in Oregon and Washington State that have adopted low carbon fuel standards, but we're, a ways away there from really seeing any substantial penetration. And we do have some spot availability on the East Coast now, as of earlier this year in the New York Harbor, as well as in Georgia. So we're seeing it here and there. And all we need to do is see more of it. I think it is really one of the great opportunities we have as a drop-in replacement for fossil-based diesel that, can give you 50 to 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions right off the bat, can be used in any vehicle, drop-in replacement. What's not to love?
Well, and we've seen, whether it was just a press release-based thing or something real, and I guess it is real, but the Volvo plant in Virginia is doing first fill with, is it hydrogenated vegetable oil, which is essentially renewable diesel, right? And, so you do have these little, pop-ups, if you will, as you mentioned in the East. Do you see a path, basically, to make more renewable diesel and to get it to be more of a factor in an over-the-road truck environment?
I do. I'm relentlessly optimistic on this. I think, in the last 3 years or so, we've seen a great rush to build capacity to produce more renewable diesel. We saw a lot of the traditional petroleum majors make some major investments in recent days, years, months, to bring on more capacity to produce the fuel. And then we have, the Inflation Reduction Act and all that it offers in terms of sustainable aviation fuel. So that's produced in the same way. It's basically renewable diesel with one additional step in the refining process. So you've got to move afoot to bring more renewable diesel fuel slash sustainable aviation fuel to the population as fast as possible. So you've got a lot more capacity to produce it, and we need to have the right kind of policy that gets into the feedstocks and allowing that to really flourish there. But I think we can have more penetration. And if somebody were to say, "What do you think the trucking industry looks like in 10 years?" I think the last 10 years have been pretty much all diesel. The next 10 years are going to be a diversity of fuels more. I think diesel's still the mainstream, but you're definitely going to have niche markets of fuel based on where you are, what you have access to. It might be hydrogen for ICE. It might be hydrogen for fuel cells. It might be renewable diesel because that makes sense for your operation. So I think you're going to see that more of a niche kind of setting for fuels and technology within this industry.
Yeah, we had the rather young but impressive, I think, CEO of Clearflame on a few weeks back, and he talked about ethanol, which I have some background in from my days at General Motors. I worked on in the old corn days, before the before the food industry kind of put a stake in that one. But the idea is that he's got a technology, an engine technology, to essentially make ethanol work, at a certain level. So I guess you put, as you said, these different opportunities out there. That's one, right? And I imagine there's a few others. But at this point, I want to spend just a few minutes because it does take an advanced degree to sort this out. But to talk about this low carbon fuel standard in California. Now, they are more or less picking winners at this point with some changes they have planned, right? Is that what you're seeing?
They are, and this has been percolating now for almost a year. They've proposed some recent changes and some what they call 15-day amendments that get into basically accelerating the reduction in carbon intensity of the transportation fuel pool, going from 5% to 9%, starting in next year, 2025, and at the same time taking away some of the least cost, most available feedstocks to produce renewable diesel in soy and canola are being capped, how much they can be used. So we're starting to see, I guess, the maturity of that program in California is now, at a point where they're starting to reassess sort of what they have and kind of where it's going in the future. And some fuels like renewable natural gas, which are part of that low carbon fuel standard, would favor these changes in some ways because it accelerates the carbon intensity reduction and might drive more folks to consider using a natural gas engine and RNG. On the other hand, it does create some uncertainty in the marketplace for those that are trying to produce renewable liquid fuels like renewable diesel and biodiesel. When you start limiting feedstocks like that, and that creates what we think could be disruption and some uncertainty there. And I think the other force at work here, possibly, and maybe this is just sort of a suspicion more than anything, perhaps, but any continuation of fuels and furthers the use of internal combustion engines for some folks in California is absolutely the worst thing they could possibly do. Even though the fuels are cleaner and they have lower greenhouse gas emissions and have delivered huge benefits, some folks just ideologically believe that we got to stop using anything that enables the future of ICEs, if that's cleaner fuel or changes, whatever. So I think it's troubling from that perspective, and I think it'll sort itself out here in the not too distant future. But it does going to have an impact on sort of what happens not only in California, but because these other states, as they put these policies together, are largely looking to California's experience to replicate in some cases. They might find themselves, going down a similar track, saying, "Okay, California's accelerating the reduction in carbon intensity. Maybe we should too." And so then you have, sort of a whole hodgepodge of different states and regulations and a very challenging marketplace for producers.
Well, I would imagine, if you think about California, because, talking about California and fuels is almost sort of an oxymoron, right? They're not into that. They're into electrification. And yet it sounds like from what you're describing, these changes might just be looking at drop-in fuels of any kind really as being transitional only. this is not something that they really see being part of the long play. Or am I wrong about that?
Well, I think, at a very high level, I've heard Air Resources board members say, our strategy is simple. We're going to electrify everything we can and use low carbon fuels in the things that we can. So, I guess you question is, how far can you go with electrification? How fast? And then, what is left? And it could be a lot left, based on the way things are going now in terms of, kind of what's the relative success of some of these electrification strategies now. You see some of the light duty vehicle manufacturers having a little bit of a dialing back. And also I think though that, the trucking industry is just getting started in this space. So there's bound to be some success stories. There are already for electrification and those will be building, I have no doubt. But, at the end of the day, you're going to need more than what we have in terms of electrification to meet anywhere near the climate objectives that they have. And if you put renewable fuel policies in place that discourage further production, investment, development, and use, then that's a huge problem.
Right. Well, and I don't think you and I probably aren't going to solve this one today. I don't think, but it was it was good to spend a moment. And of course, the low carbon fuel standard does one other thing, and that is that it does create revenue streams for those that are meeting it and gaining from it. We're seeing that already. For example, on the electrification side from Nikola, they've with their fuel cell trucks, they're actually booked their first revenue. It wasn't a lot, but they booked their first revenue in the second quarter from being able to sell credits. So there's that entire piece of it that we really didn't get into, and that's fine. That maybe for another day. Let's spend the rest of our time on something that I think is on more and more people's mind, and that is our upcoming elections, especially the presidential election. We've got a couple candidates who do see these things differently, and I'd like to hear your take and really the Engine Technology Forum's take on what you're seeing. I guess you're inundated, obviously, with data, in terms of what you're seeing is likely to happen in November, or how the election would influence some of the things we talked about.
Yeah. Well, it's a big question, and it's a lot of uncertainty, and it's changing by the minute. It seems like. I think, if you sit back and say, where will we be in January of next year? I think regardless of who is in the White House, we're going to see a continued reliance on internal combustion engines well into the future. We wouldn't necessarily see any policies coming down the pike one way or the other that would be more extreme than we see today. And likewise, on the other end, are there going to be policies that somehow, open up and encourage greater use or moves away from electrification towards internal combustion engines? So I don't think you see anything on either end for a variety of reasons. I would expect if there's a Harris administration that her stated priorities on things like internal combustion engine are not really clear yet. But we can, sort of look back in history and what's been happening the last 3 years, and you have to say she's more likely to be a caretaker, defender of the Biden legacy on climate, and that arguably is his biggest legacy across the board. And if you look at then, but keeping in mind sort of that particular candidate, if we look at the recent voter polls, climate ranks number 10 out of, I think it's 15 issues that we saw most recently as important to voters. So depending on what voter segment you might be trying to get to vote for you, that may have more or less meaning. So we've got that factor there. So Harris administration defends the Biden legacy more, maybe some tweaks around the edges, but there's so much in place, and you can't imagine hardly a lot more that could be done in this space, given the likely congressional makeup. Getting something through the Senate like the Inflation Reduction Act, I wouldn't think she would want to expend the political capital on that. She's got other priorities that seem to be developing, kitchen table, pocketbook financing kind of issues for sort of middle Americas, let's say. So that's sort of one thing. And so if President Trump comes back for a second term, I think there's going to be a bigger emphasis on developing our domestic energy resources. No question about that. He's been famous for saying, drill, baby, drill. And, I love fracking and all that. So we could expect to see, I think, more investment in energy resources, dealing with things like the LNG export ban. That would be probably reversed pretty quickly. So you'd start to see, a really what he would say, I think, would be an unleashing of American energy resources and capabilities. And that has some sort of indirect flow out to the internal combustion engine world in that, that's a user of that kind of particular fuel. Where is President Trump on things like electrification? Well, it's hard to say. I think he's mainly associated that with, the Biden administration forcing you to get rid of your gasoline car and buy an electric car, which is, campaign rhetoric, but it doesn't really bear out in terms of where the policy is. It's not that. But it does, manufacturers are being driven more towards producing non-ICE vehicles than ICE vehicles. So there's definitely that. And I think, his recent, alliance, if you will, with Elon Musk brings in another dynamic where it's not that he doesn't like EVs. He said, I think he doesn't like the government mandating EVs. Now, again, whether that mandating thing is real or not, that's something that is maybe in his mind.
I was going to ask you, Alan, about Elon Musk because he's got this sort of, I love your cars, but I don't really love electric vehicles or something like that. We don't need to misquote him or quote him at all. But it is interesting that, much of what happened both through the IRA that you mentioned, the infrastructure legislation, things like that, it's hard to sort of turn that off. Once that money starts to get distributed to the states and so forth, you can't really pull that back very easily, right?
Right. Well, and I think what you're seeing now is a lot of Republicans in Congress and Republican governors are seeing the benefit of that in terms of the shovels in the ground, manufacturing being built, jobs being built. So whether or not you agree with, support the ideology behind that, that's going to be hard to look away from. And so I think that's going to continue and would be hard to turn on and off. I think if you do have a Trump administration, one thing that you definitely would see, I think, is maybe less. It would be harder this time around, in my view, to see rollbacks of regulations on things like phase 3 greenhouse gas or 2027 NOx rules, for example. In terms of rolling those kind of things back, there could be some effort to do that, but it seems like it might be more challenging this time around, both on a legal sense, but also in the sense that industry is already committed to some of that in one way or the other. So it's hard to put the brakes on something where a lot of investment has been made already and strategic decisions have been made. I think what you would be more likely to see is the entertainment of flexibilities, if you will, in both the timing of mandates of zero emission vehicles and more flexibility in the implementation of that. And of course, if there's a willingness to continue to bring incentives and money to the table, because that is key to making all this work. And if you turn that spigot off, it's hard to know how well that does on its own.
Right. Well, and I think I'm hearing you say things like pulling out of Paris or whatever, not going to happen again. We'll just kind of leave that alone. And then, less symbolic and more sort of future control.
Well, it's hard to say. I think Trump has said that he would pull out of the Paris Accord again. And so, whether or not, what bearing does that have on the domestic policy versus the industries that are trying to deliver all these kinds of new technologies and reductions in emissions? I think, those are two different things. So I think, in many ways that, there's going to be some work around the edges on things if the Trump administration, second administration comes around, more unleashing of U.S. energy for sure. Whether or not we get into things like major deregulatory efforts, wait and see. I think, the other thing that's at work here is the Congress, right? And so to get Senate confirmation of your appointees and to get policies moving, you've got to have kind of bipartisan level of support. And, like I said before, in the Harris administration, the Congress, depends on what the makeup is, but it's hard to imagine her being able to pull together the same level of support for a massive spending bill like the Inflation Reduction Act. And by the same token, on the Trump side, I think the Congress would not be willing to go down the path of, getting rid of the Department of Education or EPA or anything like that. I think, yes, can there be some adjustments made? And yes, there would likely be some made, and some would be painful and some would be more symbolic. But, at the end of the day, manufacturers, both on heavy truck side, light duty vehicle side, I mean, they're already making commitments, building vehicles, sort of headed down a road of a road they don't know how long it is, how many twists and turns, how many detours there might be, but it's going to happen at some level. And so I think, that the moderation of sort of the policy would be in the best interest of all. But there's a lot of factors, and if you see if Trump does win, I would expect the Biden-Harris administration now to move as quickly as they could to issue all the waivers for California. So you would get all that in place before the administration left office. And that would then, provide California and the other states that are following California standards, the opportunity to adopt more stringent regulations and approaches. And, that is one potential of the Trump administration coming in. So, we could have more federal policy or more progressive state policy. I think the trucking industry would always prefer, a more national approach that is reflective of their life every day, which is this is an interstate industry. So, stop trying to make our lives complicated and more expensive. Just make us more efficient and effective.
Yeah. Well, Alan, we're going to need to leave it there. Thank you for that sort of analysis, really, because I'm not going to go as far as say, well, there's so many things that for our discussion don't matter about this election, but I think you hit on some of the key ones there, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate your time. So thank you for being part of Truck Take this week.
Thanks for having us, Alan. Take care.
Yep. All right, folks, we are looking forward now. November's not very far away. The Future of Freight Festival in Chattanooga, mid-November. I'm pretty sure we're still offering a discount on tickets. So you can look in the Friday Truck Tech newsletter for that. Otherwise, we will see you next week with another new show. And goodbye, everyone. Thanks for joining.